Tonight, I want to come at codependency from another angle that I think is a super important angle, and that is people who have codependency are people who didn't connect well in childhood. And I want to develop that tonight because it's so important, because the flip side of that is simply saying this: if I want to deal with my codependency and get healthy, I have to learn how to connect with people in healthy ways. And so what happens with a child, and if you have complex trauma, one way to understand complex trauma is that when you needed to connect with your parents, you couldn't. And so because of that, you felt all alone, you felt abandoned, you felt like they didn't care, but you also felt it's your fault. That the reason I can't connect with them is not that there's something wrong with them, but there's got to be something wrong with me. And then you internalize that and say, I must not be lovable or valuable. It's all my fault. And so complex trauma and codependency both come from this not connect place as a child. And that leads to how a child perceives themselves, and that's the shame message that's behind codependency, that I'm not good enough. But then what I want to look at tonight is it begins to shape how you go about trying to connect with people in adult life. And so what we're going to look at tonight is the different styles that children develop in order to try and connect, but try to keep themselves safe at the same time. And so as you can imagine, solutions that seem to work, but that don't really work. And so they create codependent relationships, which end up causing a lot of trouble. So lack of connection affects how a child perceives themselves, it affects how they go about relationships, and it affects how they regulate their emotional world. And I'm going to develop that in a sense in a minute. But what I want you to just think about tonight is we're going to look at what psychologists have defined as 3 ways that complex trauma children begin to try and form connections. They're not really healthy, but they seem to work when they're younger. And then when you get to adult life, they end up causing you to be wounded, the other person to be wounded, and they do not work at all. So that's what we're going to look at. But let me back up and just give you a little bit of background on this term connection, or the technical term is attachment. So what do we mean when we talk about connecting or attaching in a healthy way? What I do in thinking about this is, what would it be like if a child felt so safe that they could drop all their guards, all their masks, all the walls around their heart? They would be able to be emotionally connected to somebody who was emotionally available. Also with that, they would need to have their needs met in order to feel that safety, in order to be able to drop their guard. So they would need to feel totally accepted. They would need to feel unconditional love. They would need to feel respected. They would need a relationship that was consistent for them and that was fair and there was honesty. Then they could be authentic. So what I've said in the past is this: children do not lie because they decide it's a good idea. They lie to survive. Children want to be authentic, but in an unsafe environment, they can't be authentic, because if you're authentic, you get hurt. And so they learn to not be authentic. And so the question of connection is, you can't connect in a healthy way unless you live in a safe environment where you can be totally authentic. And I think what you can see right up front is that children raised in complex trauma cannot form that connection. Not because they don't want to, but because it's not safe to be authentic. And so that's what we're talking about. So if I take that a little bit further, children need that connection all the time, but they need it most when they're feeling afraid or when they see danger or when they're feeling unsettled or uncomfortable. Because built into a child is if I'm feeling danger and if I am feeling unsettled or uncomfortable, I want to run to a person who is safe and connect with them so that they can protect me. And so they feel the need for connection most in times of trouble. That usually doesn't happen in complex trauma, or it happens very inconsistently. And so again, a child isn't able to form a consistent, healthy bond with their caregiver in those situations. So that is a bit of a background on attachment. What I want you to understand is this. We were made with this need to attach. It is built into the very core of every human being. We live in a culture where we want to kid ourselves into thinking we don't need anybody. We can do it all on our own. But I think if people get honest, they realize, no, I want connection. And as far back as you can think or remember, you can remembering wanting to feel part of, wanting to belong, wanting to feel a connection with somebody. So it is built into us. What is fascinating to me is this. When you look at the effects of drugs and alcohol, do you want to know what emotions they create inside of a person? The emotions of connection. And so what happens inside of a person is if they can't connect to a person, they will connect with something. And that will be either an activity or a chemical. Because both of them will give them the feelings of connection without the risk of healthy connection. Now, if you're going to make it in recovery, you can no longer be connecting to a chemical because that no longer works. You have to begin to learn how to connect with safe people in a healthy way. And that's where we're going to get into at the end of our talk tonight. Next thing I want you to think about is the value of connection in times of danger. So what happens to a child in a healthy home when they get upset? So the term we use is their emotions become dysregulated. So they don't regulate their own emotions because they're panicking. They're afraid and they're starting to freak out and all of that and crying, and they run to mom or dad. And if it's a healthy mom or dad, they take their cues from mom and dad about how mom and dad respond. And if mom and dad aren't being freaked out by the events but are calm because they have the tools to deal with it, then the child takes comfort from the fact that mom and dad are regulated, and then they regulate themselves. So as they learn from mom and dad and how mom and dad deal with problems and are able to regulate their emotions, it imprints into their nervous system the tools for regulating stress, discomfort, fear, all of those emotions, so that when they get to adulthood, they don't need mom and dad to help them regulate anymore. They can regulate themselves. Now, if you take somebody from complex trauma, one of the big things that comes out of more severe complex trauma is borderline personality disorder. And what is the key characteristic of that? They can't regulate their emotions once their fear gets triggered. They go from 0 to 100 in a nanosecond. They become irrational, and they don't know how to regulate their emotions. So they're still at a child's ability when it comes to regulating their emotions. So attachment, healthy attachment, leads to regulation of emotions. Such an important thing. What I want you to understand through all of this is if a child doesn't attach, you get the abandonment feeling that happens, which leads to the shame feeling, which leads to problems regulating emotions, which leads to problems with relationships, with conflict, all of that stuff. So here's a couple things that have been written. I just wanted to read them to you. Moderately to severely dysregulated nervous systems can lead to addictive behaviors in adulthood. And all of you can relate to that. Then the next one is this. Love or relationship addicts, which is codependency, are chronically dysregulated. In other words, if you want to understand one of the characteristics of a codependent relationship, look for emotional dysregulation. One or both will be dysregulated when they get triggered, and then they trigger each other, and then they just escalate higher and higher, and then you got a gong show on your hands, and most of you have been there. So what I want you to understand is this. Codependency is all about problems in attaching in childhood. It goes back to that very core thing. So you go, okay, how do I know two things? If I had a decent attachment growing up, or secondly, how do I know if I'm attaching to my children? Because I want to form a healthy attachment with my children. So there's really four things that disrupt healthy attachment. So the technical term is healthy attachment we call secure attachment. So the child feels very secure because they feel safe, loved, accepted, valued, respected. That's secure attachment. They can drop their guard. They don't need any masks. They don't feel they have to walk on eggshells. They can be totally authentic. Okay? Unhealthy is insecure attachment. So four things that disrupt it. So we start with the stages of development in a child. So most of you attached to your newborn baby, that infant, you held them, you nursed them, you cooed over them, you spent as much time as possible with them, you kept their life safe, you met all their physical needs, and you worked hard to attach, okay? What I want you to see as we go through this is we're going to look at 5 different stages of development in a child. For a child to have secure attachment, they need to feel connected in all 5 stages. If you only connected in 1 or 2 stages, but not in all 5, then the child will pick up insecure attachment, okay? So stage 2 is toddlerhood as they begin to walk. But what I want you to understand about toddlerhood is all of a sudden this child is a little harder to manage because they're into everything and they're exploring and they're curious and they don't really have very good boundaries on their own. And then you go into the child as they go off to school. Then you go to the pre-adolescent, 10 to 12, and then the teenage years. And so some of you might be sitting there thinking, I attached good in stage 1 and 2, and then after that, it's been downhill. Don't go to beating yourself up. Because what I want you to understand is that you can always repair insecure attachment. If your child begins to feel that you're getting healthy and you're becoming safe, they still want to attach to you. And so you can repair a lot of the damage. But that's the first way that healthy attachment can be interrupted. Secondly, is inconsistent parenting. So let me just say this. I get a lot of clients, addicts, who come to me and say, I'm a really good parent. And what they mean and what I point out to them is that when you're clean and sober, you're a good parent. The problem is you're not always clean and sober. So to your child, they love it when you're clean and sober, but when you're relapsed and back in the problem, there's no connection with you at all. So inconsistent parents results in insecure attachment. Third one, if you were uncomfortable about some topic because of your own issues, and you therefore wouldn't let your child talk to you about what they were struggling with, you shut them down, then they felt all alone. and they felt the connection with you break a little bit. So everything that they have inside of them that they know they can't talk to you about, either because you'll go crazy or you'll get angry or you'll judge them, that breaks the attachment. And then the fourth is when mom and dad split. That disrupts the attachment. Now, I just want to add, if you are working on yourself and you are separated, yes, there's damage that's been done, but if you're working on yourself, a child that can attach to one parent is a wonderful thing. It's way better than a child that can attach to either parent. And so, again, attachment with your child isn't about gimmicks that you do to try to get them to talk to you. Attachment with your child is about you becoming healthy and safe. And your child already wants to attach with you. They're just waiting for you to become a person they can safely attach to. So let me go into the 3 types of insecure attachment. And what these are the 3 different ways a child learns to cope with lack of attachment, and that then comes into their adult life, and it shows up in codependency. So some of these you're going to understand from some of the stuff we've already talked about, but the first one is anxious attachment. So this is a child that is reaching out to mom and dad as a kid, wanting to connect, but they don't want to connect with you. And so you begin to operate by the belief that nobody will want to connect with me just the way I am, because mom and dad didn't want to connect with me. So as you come into adult life, your fear in forming relationships is rejection. Your belief under that fear is that if people get to know me, they will reject me. And therefore, people will only connect with me if I wear masks, if I give up my needs, if I give up my desires, if I become a non-person, then they'll want to connect with me, which is really no connection at all. So what happens then to an anxious person when they get into a relationship is they don't get their needs met because they're putting those aside. Okay? Result of that, and a lot of this happens at a subconscious level, they're not happy. Their needs aren't met. There's an emptiness inside. There's a pain inside because of that. And so their whole thought is that person that I'm trying to have a relationship with is the one I need to meet my needs. So they hyper-analyze every little detail of the relationship. So let's say that you've been in a relationship and it's been going along really, really well. And almost every day your partner's quite upbeat and quite warm. And then you wake up one day and you don't know right up front that they got a headache. And so they're just a little bit distant that day. What do? Do you focus on the last month and how wonderful it is and then look at today in light of the last month? No, you go, oh, they're distant. They're pulling away from me. And you overanalyze it. So you get this tunnel vision that focuses on that one thing, and then you start blowing it up in your mind. And now you're going, oh, I noticed yesterday that I went to touch them. They didn't reach out and grab my hand and want to touch me. I think they're pulling away from me and they don't want close. And now you're reading in all kinds of negative things. So if you've been that person in a relationship, or you've been in a relationship with somebody like that, that can drive you crazy. Because now they want to analyze it over and over, and they keep going to the worst case scenario. Do you want to know what they're doing? They're fulfilling their core belief that you're going to leave them. They've already decided that. Now they're just looking for evidence to support that. And so the first little sign, it doesn't even have to be true, but it looks like it might possibly be true. That fits their core belief, and they run with that. And so that begins to cause them to obsess, to question, to analyze, and then they have to do things because now they feel more insecure, they have greater anxiety, so now they start playing little games with you to try and see if you're going to pull away more. So all of a sudden they don't give you any attention to see if you'll chase them. And if you're not chasing them around, they go, see, that proves they're pulling away from me. Or they give you all kinds of mixed messages. They don't return your phone calls to see how you'll respond. All of those things begin to happen. And it's a person acting out of an anxiety place with a core belief that if you get to know me, you'll reject me. So some of you can relate to that. Then the flip side is the person that we call avoidant attachment. And so this is the child that's tried to be involved with mom and dad, but mom and dad just neglect them. But the child doesn't want to become needy or full of anxiety. They harden themselves. And they go, I don't need anybody. I can do this on my own. And what they're trying to do is protect themselves from any future feelings of rejection. Because they're trying to say, I don't need anybody, so rejection doesn't bother me. So this is the person that when they get in a relationship, they avoid closeness. So you got the anxious person wanting closeness, pushing for closeness. You got the avoidant person keeping you at arm's length. In their mind, their strength is that they are an independent, self-sufficient person, and that is more important to them than intimacy, because intimacy to them feels like neediness. Intimacy to them feels like I'm becoming less of a person because I'm less independent and self-sufficient. And so they don't share their feelings. They're not great talkers about that kind of stuff. Talking's about, do you want sex tonight, or what's happening with the kids? Business kind of stuff. That is what's happening. And for many of them, they have trouble committing themselves to relationships. So they like lots of casual relationships. They like lots of romantic relationships. But that word commitment to them means lack of freedom, lack of independence, lack of self-sufficiency, which means I'm going to get smothered or engulfed by somebody else. And I'll lose me in the process. So they avoid that kind of commitment. But if you get them to commit, once they commit, they like to create kind of mental distance by focusing on their partner's flaws and pointing them out, or they review with their buddies how great single life was and how great it was to have freedom, and how they've got a ball and chain now called their wife that's holding them down. And they begin to put their marriage in that kind of language to create a distance again. So they resist intimacy. The other person, the anxious person, is pursuing intimacy but overdoing it. So those two types of things are happening. So just as the anxious person was hypervigilant about whether the person was pulling away, signs of distance, the avoidant person is hypervigilant about the other person's attempts to control them. So as soon as their partner says, would you do this for me, they get their back up. Because they don't want to be controlled. They're very hypersensitive to that. They will engage in distancing behaviors, like I'm just going to make decisions without consulting my partner. I like that big screen TV for $1,000. I'll buy it. I'm not even going to ask them. I'll just show up with it. And they live by it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. And they want to create distance by that. Or if their partner comes and says, you didn't consult me, or you haven't been talking to me, or you haven't been spending time with me, they go needy, needy, and they pride themselves. They're not weak like that. So you relate to that kind of thing. So that's going on. Now, can you see, for some reason, those two attract each other? Okay, I'm going to come back to that because I want you to think about that. But before we get there, I want to give you the third type, and that's what we call disorganized attachment. That's a child who grows up in abuse, and they can't find a solution to get out of abuse. And so one day, they are reaching out to mom and dad for help. The next day, they're running away from mom and dad. They're trying all kinds of different things because nothing's working. And so there's no real patterns. It's very disorganized. But what comes core of their being is this huge, huge fear of intimacy, because intimacy leads to conflict. Conflict leads to abandonment. And so there's constant fear in relationships, and they will often give very mixed messages when they get into a relationship in adult life that comes out of that disorganized mind. So one day they'll say, I love you, next day, go away. One day, I need you, next day, I don't need you. And you're sitting there going, what in the world am I supposed to do with this? And it gets very confusing for the other person. Now let me just add this. You can take all three of those things, those attachment styles, and you can go to the average person with complex trauma as they go to work, as they have casual friends, and you won't necessarily see those three things. When you begin to see their attachment style is when they get into an intimate relationship. And then all of a sudden, that deep fear, shame, abandonment all begins to surface, and their style is affected because of that. Okay, so let's go to this. The anxious person, the anxious style, is attracted to the avoidant style. I just find that very humorous at times as I watch it. So let me give it to you this way. The anxious one we're going to call the pursuer. The avoidant one is the distancer. So what you have is a pursuer chasing a person around, saying, please connect with me, and they say, please stay away from me and quit crowding my space. Now, what I want you to understand is they're not even aware they're doing it because it happens at a subconscious level. And they're not even aware that they need to do it to try and meet some deep down need inside of themselves. So the distancer, they would never admit it because they think, I don't need anybody, but deep down, they want somebody to chase them. That is important. And then the anxious person, the chaser, the pursuer, they need somebody to chase to feel that they're getting their needs met and getting attention and conquering somebody. So you always end up typically in codependent relationships that come out of complex trauma, a pursuer after a distancer, not wanting it to happen. Now, I want to take that a bit further because here's what I want you to understand. Do you realize if you were to take an anxious person or an avoidant person, so a pursuer or a distancer, and say, have a relationship with this very healthy person, do you want to know what they'd say? Boring. They need the chase. They need the conflict. They need all of that compulsive behavior to feel alive. So that's the need that is being met. And so they're not ever attracted to a healthy person because that wouldn't meet that need for that adrenaline and the chaos and the conflict. So they go chasing unhealthy people with the same shame issues, just two separate ways of responding to that shame, one anxious, one avoidant. But what I always want clients to understand is this. That might give you a rush to be in a chase or being pursued, but it always backfires. They never work out to be healthy relationships. They always end up being so full of conflict that they break down and become unlivable. Take that further. Do you realize that the anxious person and the avoidant person, or the chaser and the pursuer, never learned how to connect in a healthy way? So they are both emotionally unavailable. So they don't even know if they stopped and said, let's do this healthy. They don't know what healthy would look like because they don't know how to connect. And so you want to know what the chaser says to the avoidant? They're never emotionally available to me. You want to know what the avoidant one says? I'm afraid to talk to them because if I did, it wouldn't be about my stuff. They'd start talking about their stuff. So I don't feel they're emotionally available either. And so it breaks down over and over again. But sadly, it ends up validating the core belief that everybody that gets to know me will leave me. Because that's eventually what happens. So what it ends up being is this cycle that keeps reinforcing the core belief of shame. I'm not good enough. Everybody that gets to know me will reject me and abandon me. End of story. And you keep in the cycle and it keeps proving it to you, but you're afraid to leave that cycle. So that leads me to my final question, and that is, okay, how do we change that? So we spend a lot of time in recovery from trauma talking about the need for healthy connection. And I don't want to take the time to go into detail on that. We've done lots of other stuff about that. But let me just say this tonight. I think one of the hardest things to do in that is to find some safe people who are somewhat healthy. And you go, where in the world do I look for that? And I get asked that all the time. But then there's a second, and it's probably even more difficult. It's to go about a relationship very slowly. So I'm not going to rush into this. I'm going to very, very, very gradually, and by very, very, very gradually, I don't mean 2 weeks, I mean 6 months to a year, get to watch a person, know them, without getting sold out to that person in an unhealthy way. And over that time, I begin to see if there's red flags. I begin to see if they're healthy. I begin to see if there's even a chance of connecting. And if they are healthy, you begin to gradually connect. And as you connect, you can drop your mask, your guard, and you heal. But it's a very slow, gradual process. What makes it difficult for complex trauma is you think you have connection when you feel intensity. You mistake connection for the feeling of intensity. So that's why you like the intense relationships. That's all limbic brain. What you're wanting to do is realize connection happens gradually as you get to know a person who is safe and healthy, and it's a very slow thing, often not having a whole bunch of feelings with it. It's just the process of getting to know somebody. What I want you to take away as the message of this second half is that God wants to attach with us. So a lot of people, I think, when they come into recovery, just in their mind, they just want to attach with a higher power. But what I want you to be able to kind of take in is that ever since God created these things called human beings, he's wanted to connect with us. And so as the song said, he's chasing us. There's nothing that's going to get in the way of that. So I want to give you a little different perspective on that. So if you think of going on your first date, now most of you wouldn't think of going in your pajamas with your bed head happening and all of that. When you go on your first date, you want to go so you're attractive to the other person, okay? And then what you tend to do, often consciously or maybe not even consciously, is there part of you that wants to impress your date so that they go, wow, this person is great, not just hot, they're great, and I want a relationship with them, right? So what God has done is, how do I get people to want a relationship with me? I want one with them. How do I attract them to me? So he does two things. How do I make myself known? So the first one we know about and hear most often about is he revealed himself through the writings of the Bible, what he is like. But there's a second way, and that is through creation. So in Psalm 19, it says this: the heavens proclaim the glory of God. And that word glory means the beauty of God. It declares what God is like. It puts on display how wonderful he is. So it's the skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day, they continue to speak. Now what it's saying is that the skies, the stars at night, the galaxies, nature is always speaking, but then it says without a word. So they speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is never heard, yet their message has gone through the earth and their words to all the world. So not everybody's going to receive a Bible and read it, but every single person that lives is going to see creation. And so God is saying, I am putting myself on display for every single person, because they just got to look up into the stars at night. They got to look at sunsets and mountains and oceans and all of that, and they go, wow, there's something bigger than me. There's something about how all of this works together that shows a wisdom that orchestrated it all and designed it all. It's like this amazing Rolex watch where everything just works in perfect synchronicity. All of those things, and you go, that is an amazing creator, and that was the design of all of that. Now let me just get you to think of this. Let me say I went to my kids, so you got to imagine this, so you got to use your brain a bit more than you might like to, but just imagine I'm the strongest man in the world, okay? Just try to take your brain there. So let's say I go to my kids and I go, I'm the strongest man in the world. Now, kids tend to believe their dad's the strongest man. But I go, I'm going to prove that I'm the strongest man in the world. And I bring a little kid from kindergarten and I beat him up. They're going to go, nah, Dad, that's not proof that you're the strongest man. Let's bring the second strongest man in the world. And then you fight him. And if you win that, then we'll be convinced you're the strongest man. So what God has done is he said, I'm going to put myself on display in ways that show that no weakling could have done this, that no mediocre could have done this. This is in the class of supreme excellence that you're going to see this. So what I want to do tonight, is take you on a bit of a journey into one of the ways God puts on display his greatness, his beauty, and it's through the world of monsoons. And I don't know if you've ever studied monsoons. Kim and I, about 2 years ago, watched a documentary series. I think it was a 4 or 5 part series on monsoons, and it was fascinating. And it gave to me this new appreciation of the design of our planet and how all the climate systems work together. So that is the monsoon area in orange of the world. And what you need to understand about that is that that's about half of the world's population. And so what a monsoon is that those parts of the world don't have rain for 7 or 8 months of the year, and then they have basically non-stop rain for 4 or 5 months of the year. There's records in India that sometimes during that 4 to 5 month rainy season that they'll get a meter of rain in one day. So that's the deluge that comes on. What I found out in this series was that so half of the world is affected by monsoons. We don't get it in North and South America, but that feeds their entire economy. So all of their economy is dependent on those monsoons coming. And so as you begin to understand how they come about, it is absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to get you to do that with me. So there's 2 starting points for a monsoon. One is in the south, one is in the north. Both involve great amounts of heat close to the ocean, okay? So in Australia, I don't know if you've ever watched Australia in our winter, but it gets up to 40 degrees, and then in their very dry spots, you'll get these tornadoes of fire. And you watch them as they cycle in the middle of those, and they go about 100 meters high. It gets to about 1,000 degrees Celsius in the middle of those tornado fires, okay? So it's superheated hot air that goes way up in the sky. So what happens when you get a whole lot of heat that's creating into the sky? It draws in air. It needs to be fed. And so where does that air come from? Well, Australia is an island in the middle of the ocean, so it starts to draw in air from the ocean, but it's so hot that it's drawing in fast air. So it's creating storms on the ocean, and so the ocean begins to get stirred up, but all of this moist air is coming in and gets sucked up, and it goes up those tornadoes, and it shoots it high up into the sky, and so now you get clouds, okay? But what's happening in the ocean as it gets stirred up is it's stirring up all the nutrients from the bottom of the ocean that the plankton feed on, and that then feeds thousands and thousands of fish. But that's a different story. That has nothing to do with the actual monsoon. It's just one of the benefits of it is it stirs the ocean and brings the nutrients to the surface. So all of that hot air, the higher it goes, that cooled, moist air, as it cools, forms clouds. Those clouds get heavier. So that's Australia, okay? The north is the Tibetan Plateau. So right underneath that, you'll see a gray line. That's the Himalayan mountains. Okay, so the tallest mountain range in the world. Just north of that is a large flat section called the Tibetan Plateau, part of China, and that is what they call basically a hot plate. So it gets super hot, and that draws all the moist air. So you see India there at the bottom in the middle. All of the Indian Ocean, moist air gets drawn in, and guess what it hits? The Himalaya mountains. And it can't go any further. So now you get building clouds, building water, huge amounts of water that are being drawn in by this hot plate on the plateau, stopped by the Himalayan mountains, and it's accumulating. And then in Australia, you got this accumulating water coming out of all of this heat as well. So you got 2 huge cloud systems that now start to join. Follow what's going on there? Okay, so then it starts to rain. This part, so you got to keep your thinking cap on, because I'm going to give you a bit of a geography lesson here. So right in the middle there, you see this black line that goes all the way down. Well, that's the Mekong River. It's 2,500 miles long, and it feeds or goes through 5 different countries in Southeast Asia. So you see Vietnam, Laos, and all of that up through there. Okay, so that is the Mekong River. So what happens once the monsoon starts? the Mekong River increases its flow by 400%. Can you imagine if the Red River increased its flow by 400%? There would not be a Winnipeg. The flood of 97 would be just a little bit of a joke. But this Mekong River increases by 400%. And so all of these countries then, this river that was very small, it overflows its banks and it just starts to spread. But there's another thing, so you got to follow as it comes down. I'm going to go to the next slide. You see it turns into Cambodia, and you see Phnom Penh there, the little black dot. That's where it joins up with another river, okay? And then it goes down into the ocean. So above Phnom Penh, you see a lake there, and that's Tonle Sap Lake, okay? So what happens is there's so much water coming down the Mekong River that it hits this other river that's trying to get to the ocean, and there's so much water that the water from that lake reverses and goes backwards. And it now goes back into that lake, and that lake grows by 8 times its normal size. And I've actually watched satellite maps of Tonle Sap Lake growing and growing, but more than that, so now you got the water from the Mekong meeting this other river, and then it's backing up into this lake, but millions of fish are now going into this lake that's growing and growing and growing, okay? Then the monsoon stops, and then the river changes direction and starts heading back to the ocean, and it empties out all of these millions of fish, and there they get 30,000 tons of fish in Cambodia, and it's their main food supply, and it's all because of a monsoon. Isn't that fascinating? But more than just providing all this fish, because all of these rivers overflow because this lake grew to 8 times its normal size, now you got all this silt that was carried, and guess what? It fertilizes the whole country. They don't need fertilizer now because they've got all this silt that was carried down from the mountains and has spread because of the overflowing rivers and lakes. And then, because of the rivers backing up, there's salt in that, and they have this area, 12,000 miles, that becomes this flat of land where the water dries and turns into salt, and they have a huge salt factory that harvests all this salt just because of a monsoon. And then all of the river water getting to the river starts to drop the nutrients and all the dirt that it picked up that was going quite quickly down the river, slows down when it hits the ocean and creates a delta. And that delta has all kinds of nutrients that go into the water that feed the fish. Okay, so you got all of that information, and that's only one little wee part of what happens with a monsoon. Do you see that? You could say, well, isn't that an interesting coincidence? It gets hot in Australia, and it gets hot in Tibet, and then you get a big rainstorm, and then you go, but it happens every year. It happens at a predictable time. The whole economy, keeping people alive, is dependent on it. Half of the world's population is dependent on it, and it comes like clockwork. Now, isn't that a coincidence? And you go, wow, I wonder who designed that so that it somehow would work like that. And that's what happened. So let me give you just one little more detail beyond that. So as I'm watching this, you go, okay, those years, those months of drought. So it's 4 or 5 months of rain, but there's 7 or 8 months of drought. What happens as the drought gets worse and worse? Plants start to dry, everything, the food, there's no more food for the animals, etc. And then I found out there's this one tree called the mahua tree, and guess when it bears its fruit? At the driest time of the year, right before the monsoon. So just when the animals are running out of things to eat, this weird tree, out of total dryness, pops out fruit, and the animals get to their last meal before the monsoon comes. So what I've done ever since I was a boy is I said I love to learn about nature because in learning about nature, I learn about God. And as I learn about nature, I learn about God's greatness, but his genius mind to design such an intricate web of systems that need each other, but they feed each other, and they keep this old planet going, and they keep us alive. And so what God is saying is, I hope when you look at the monsoon and you look at that dumb mahua tree, you go, wow. And God says, I just put myself on display. I hope you're impressed enough to want to know a little bit more about me and have a relationship with me. And that's the design. Let's pray.